Today is Friday, February 24th, 2023. My name is John Robinson, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. I'm here with my broadcast partner and co-host, Mr. Wallace G. Smith. Mr. Smith, how are you doing?
I am doing wonderfully. Feels good to get the magazine off today to the printer. Not to the printer, but to reviewers. But thank you for asking.
Yeah. No, that was a relief to get that finished today. A very interesting issue. In fact, this is the first time in a while that I've thought we need to get this out to newsstands before the news cycles change. Yeah. But a pretty interesting one. Hopefully, our readers and subscribers will enjoy it. And it also prompted our topic for today, which is...
It did. Today, we're going to talk about artificial intelligence because everybody else is talking about it. And whether you're aware or not, it certainly will impact your life. We want to think about it rightly. So we're going to hit it.
Let's break it down.
Let's do it. Welcome back. And we are going to talk about artificial intelligence. I'm not sure if all you've been listening to the news or not. You might be tired of hearing about it. I know this article that we've been doing, my wife, Mr. Robinson, told me this morning, she says, "Oh, I'm so tired of hearing you say AI. I can't wait for this article to be done." And I said, "I don't know, baby. It's just going to be impacting your life forever."
She's awfully optimistic. I'm not sure that's going to change how much she hears it.
That's right. But before we go, I have to ask. I've actually been holding off because I wanted to ask after we started. You appear to be drinking something that looks as though it is dirty water with grass clippings from mowing the lawn. But I think I know what it is, and I don't want to say because I want to see if I'm right before I say anything. What are you drinking there?
All right, so this is yerba mate.
Mate, right? Yeah. Okay.
I'd heard of it before, but Tyler Wayne is really more of the guy who kind of turned me on to it, and because he knew how to do it properly.
Right.
I don't want to start a church international incident, but I've been experimenting with it for 3 or 4 days, different ways to do it. Because if you do it properly, you have this relatively small. I'm gonna call it a cup. I'm sure it has a name. It's relatively small. You put this thing that looks like a half straw, half spoon, and it's filtered on the bottom. And you put the yerba mate in kind of at an angle, and you lay this straw over it, and it kind of holds it in place. And you pour a small amount of hot water. I think it's supposed to be 180 degrees. And don't spoiler to any of you travel to Argentina for the feast, and then you get offered this yerba mate. Do not move the straw. I probably shouldn't even say that because I think that they'll spoil some of the fun of the Argentinians. But you don't move it. So naturally, what have I done today here, Mr. Smith? I followed none of those rules. I went and got a Texas-size cup, put probably way too much of it in there, poured 12 ounces of hot water on it. It's floating, it's sinking, nothing's being held in place. And I just don't have time to sit here and keep refilling it. Well, which was that's the way I did it the first time, and it was kind of neat. It really did, and it felt a little more special and more ceremonial. But today it's just, I want a big yerba mate.
Well, that's cool. That is what I thought it was, but honestly, I could not remember the name. Well, let me say this: I was going to misremember the name. I was going to call it matcha, which is more what you're seeing at Starbucks, which is a different thing. And I know, thankfully, Tyler Wayne does listen to the podcast, so I'm sure he'll take me to task. He and Ben Graham showed me, because I went to South America and spent time with brethren down there. In fact, maybe some of you are listening to this. But anyway, if you were the ones who recommended mate to Tyler Wayne, and now you've recommended Mr. Robinson's giving it a shot.
Maybe it's a large prank, and it really is grass clippings from South America. It's pretty tasty for grass clippings.
Yeah, y'all like really do seem to enjoy it. It's kind of cool. Okay, enough of that. We need to talk about the artificial intelligence apocalypse that is upon us.
It is here.
It is here. We just need to go ahead and submit to the new computer overlords and get it over with.
I think I'm a good example of this because you've always been really interested in the idea of AI. More the concept than anything else.
Right.
Not that you're looking for AI assistants to live your life. And I'm just not that interested in the topic overall. And I've listened to a bunch of podcasts where they kind of start talking about it, and I always start hitting the skip forward 15 seconds. But at this point, especially now with what's out there and what's available, that's available to the public, and of course, working on this issue in your article, like it's it's kind of a big deal, and it's here whether we like it or not, and it's going to shape our world going forward. And we may not even be aware of that it is.
Yeah, thank you for putting it that way. I really do think so. I've written on the topic before, and I understand it can be not exciting. And I have to admit also, part of what I enjoy about it is kind of the philosophical ideas about intelligence and sentience that don't excite people as much as kind of what's happening now. But I still think they're at the heart of things. I wrote 2 articles in the past, way back. In fact, it was 2015, May, June. I have it in front of me. And I was so excited. The title was called Artificial Intelligence, Promise or Peril. And you illustrated that issue, and you put a mecha. Do you remember that one in the magazine?
Yep.
Yeah. So do you remember that one?
Was that the cover we actually went with?
Oh, it wasn't the cover. It was on the inside.
Oh yeah. I know, but I do. I remember.
Oh, you had this great looking mecha there with guns, and I was thrilled. I couldn't believe I was going to have a mecha in my own article. So anyway, so artificial intelligence, promise or peril, and then I did one a little more recently, August 2021, In Our Own Image, which was more about the idea that what is the possibility that artificial intelligence could kind of grow to the point that it's the equivalent of human intelligence, not just in terms of mechanical smarts, but actual sentience, etc.
Well, here's an example of that. So, how long ago did you say the first AI was? Maybe 3 or 4 years ago.
Oh boy, well, the first article, 2015. So that's about
a long time ago. Well, even so, even with your more recent one. So the way we illustrated those was the way we always do. We have a large stock art category we can search through, and we find images, and we just kind of have what was already composited by people, artists. And this time, can we talk about what's coming up?
Sure.
We have fully AI generated images that we'll be publishing in this magazine.
Yeah, as examples.
We did not go find something. We described what we wanted. The AI generated it, and it's kind of mind blowing.
Yeah, it really is. That's part of why this is an important topic to talk about, because the technology is accelerating so quickly. We know we have audience members. This is the Living Youth podcast. We have teenagers. We have young adults. Now, on one hand, you have technology that you adapt to because it's new to you, and you have other technology that you grow up with because it's always been there. And sometimes it's radically different. I mean, it's hard for our younger audience to understand what life was like, say, before the internet.
And before smartphones.
And before smartphones. And I would encourage you to try to imagine your life without the internet. It would be hard to do because it impacts you in ways you don't even know. And even then, I would just say, even if you sat down to really think about it strongly, you're still going to have a hard time because it's so present.
Yep. You know what I think back on the most of the the internet came along where it really when I was about, let's say 24. And now thinking back on it, what blows me away is that the way we used to find businesses and information is we would take a 6-inch thick book called the Yellow Pages. If you wanted to know somebody's phone numbers, that was in the white section up front, and then you get in the back am I remembering this correctly? The Yellow Pages in the back, or was it its own separate book?
Well, it eventually at least became its own separate book, to be sure. Yeah.
So if you wanted plumbing, you pulled out these Yellow Pages and you flipped through all the plumbers, and they would have their number and their ads in it, and just like finding information. We take for granted how quickly we find information, and in the old days, you have to get a book out and thumb through it.
Absolutely. That's why used to be you'd have what plumber are you going to call? Well, AAA plumbing. Yeah. Why is it AAA? Because everything was listed in alphabetical order, and that put them up at the top. So everything changes if the technology shift is large enough. Increasingly, artificially intelligent, empowered technology is showing itself to potentially be powerful enough so that some of you are going to be impacted in terms of young adults with the jobs coming. But as those of you who are young, even younger teens, it's possible by the time you're going to college, entering the workforce, that it's going to be a given around you in terms of the tools that are powered by these things. An article I read in researching for the article that we wrote highlighted that you had that kind of first generation of artificial intelligence really changing things, and it was a little more invisible. like your Google searches are actually worked with by artificial intelligence. Your Instagram feed, your social media is a lot of artificial intelligence that is trying to figure out what to feed you, what to give you,
Right.
what is the piece of information that you need. That's not some human that's actually figuring all that out. It's artificial
Well, we
intelligence.
call it the algorithm,
That's
but
exactly right.
that doesn't do it justice.
It doesn't do it justice. However, this is different. This is artificial intelligence that's capable of producing original content. It's called generative AI, is one of the things, one of the ways to which it's referred. Generative AI that produces text and music and art. And it really is fascinating. Frankly, currently, the legal quandaries are so great that I know there's a lawsuit currently in progress against Midjourney and I think some others, as because what they do is the artificial intelligence learns based on all that you feed it, and it learns to imitate those, kind of like, to a certain extent you could make it analogous to a human being who is exposed to various styles, learning to be an artist, and then learns to reproduce some of that kind of art, not the original art itself, but in the same style of that art. But it's still not exactly the same thing. So I don't want to get into the legal stuff, but essentially now you have artificial intelligence, and some of you may have been who's are in tune to the news. That's part of what's different, though, I guess. Some of this you had to sort of be in the field or kind of be poking around to come across this information or paying attention to certain science magazines. But now you're looking at headlines. You're looking at the New York Times. You're looking at Fox News. You're looking at this stuff beginning to make a splash. Why? Because the tools, I think to me it's a combination of two things. The tools are so powerful and they've been opened up more broadly for people to interact with. And I think that's part of why we're seeing so much today and why it seemed like it was worth talking about.
So you want to take us through a little bit here in your discovery of it? What's some of the milestones have been?
Yeah, for me, and that's going to be different for each of us. At least for me, I've been really keeping my ear to the ground about AI for a long time. One, because just even as a kid, I'll be up front. Star Wars had droids, and so from at least that time when I was 7 years old, the idea of machines that could possibly think like us and act like us, I loved that idea. So I remember way back with my old Commodore 64. Kids, I know most of you probably have no idea what that is. Ask your parents, and if they don't know, they can ask their parents. But I had a Commodore 64, and you could program in BASIC. And I remember getting a book because not everybody had hard drive or any kind of disk drive back then. You would literally type in the code from scratch. And I remember coding a baby version of a program that its developers had called Eliza. And it was meant to be a chatbot, essentially the equivalent of a chatbot. You would type something in and it would respond. But it was really just tricking you. It was doing barely any substantial processing at all. And you could discover super quickly this thing has no idea, what it's
Right,
what it's
right.
what it's really doing. It was just kind of baby gaga goo goo. It's almost like the machines you put a quarter in, and it's got like an animated figure, like animatronic, and an arm moves up and down and it turns. It really is just more smoke and mirrors. But still, keeping track of these things. And then you had Siri eventually come out that Apple bought. We talked about that. So now you're talking to your phone and it's processing some of what you say, but what was your word in describing Siri earlier today, Mr.
Well,
Robinson?
I don't know if this is the one you're looking for, but I found it disappointing. I thought that it was pretty limited in what its capabilities were.
Right. It was less an assistant and more of a way to verbally,
like you could give verbal commands. Is all it really did. It wasn't really thinking through anything. It was doing its best to respond to voice commands.
Yeah, and that's really just about it, right? So, in fact, I remember it wasn't even a smartphone one of our members had years ago. In fact, he used voice on his phone before I ever did. He had a flip phone of some sort, and he wanted to call someone, and he just said, "Oh, call so and so," and the phone, was able to do that. Well, anyway, so keeping track of these things, whenever GPT-3 came out, and that's when I wrote my article about In Our Own Image. I wrote about that, this amazing what's called this large language model that was able to reproduce works in different styles, imitate different speakers and writers. It could even do rudimentary coding, even though you can't trust its code. You
And
got to get
when
in there
was
and work
that,
with it.
roughly?
That article was 2021. I'm not
Okay.
real sure when ChatGPT was released, but you had apps being built because all being tested, and the company OpenAI was really making things very open and available for research purposes. Now that Microsoft has purchased them, I'm not sure how much that'll last, but regardless, it was out there and it had consumed billions of pieces of material, et cetera, to kind of process and teach itself how language works, and it becomes a great pattern recognition system.
So what was your real breakthrough moment where you thought, we're not waiting for AI to be mature, like it's here?
Well, it is definitely still going to mature. However, that is a good question. I did have certain moments when it comes to text. When Chat GPT was released for the public, and I was expecting good things if it's connected to GPT-3 in any way, because I was very impressed with what that's capable of doing. And so the boys and I at home were just messing with it and asking it to create dialogue between different characters. Actually, I'm not going to read them, but even today, just sort of in preparation, we've been working on this article, but also was working for the podcast and tested something. So I asked ChatGPT, for instance, to just to kind of test around. I said, "Hey, ChatGPT," I told it, write a poem in iambic pentameter about the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise. And
Who wouldn't want to hear that?
Who wouldn't want to hear that? And it did. It actually wrote that. And you can tell it knows who Darth Plagueis the Wise is. It has clearly consumed material related to that. So then I switched and said, now write a poem in common meter about the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise. And then I said, I'll go ahead and read this one because it's short. Write a haiku about the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise. And it did. It wrote the following haiku. Sith Lord seeks to cheat death. Apprentice strikes him down. Tragedy unfolds. Just a little haiku
awesome.
there. Yeah. And then I asked it to write a song in the style of Nirvana about the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise. And then finally, I said, create a dialogue in which Winnie the Pooh asks Piglet if he has ever heard the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise, and when he finds Piglet has not, relates it to him. And so it just straight up, suddenly, it generates this instantly. It gives me this like little play dialogue. It starts with Winnie the Pooh. Oh, Piglet, have you ever heard the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise? And has Piglet respond, the what now, Pooh? And so anyway, it develops the whole thing with Pooh talking to Piglet. And that's what the boys now were giving it the most ridiculous scenarios. I had C.S. Lewis, the famous, mainstream, if you will, but theologian, debating with Thanos, the villain for the Avengers, about, what he's trying to convert him to Christianity.
Yeah. Oh, I was just thinking of that one, but I couldn't remember the details.
Oh, yeah.
That one was pretty interesting.
So no matter what you gave it was able to work with that, and you can ask it to take on. But there are very real applications. There are people using it to practice interviewing for a job. You can tell it. Imagine that you are an interviewer for a Coca-Cola vending machine company, and interview me for the position of sales manager, and it will create this realistic scenario that you're interacting with. So it's really fascinating. In fact, my youngest son David is in Living Ed this year here in Charlotte, and one of the assignments they had was about taking one of the Psalms and rewriting it in common meter. And I actually said, we'll give that homework to ChatGPT and see what it says. And I tell you, Mr. Robinson, it was beautiful. I'm just going to read the first stanza, for maybe one or two stanzas. This is Psalm. Now, here's the response. Let me start and give it the full response at the beginning. So the AI, ChatGPT, all I did was say, rewrite Psalm 86 in common meter. And for those who don't know, like, I have to Wikipedia things too. Common meter is each stanza of the poem is essentially in 8 syllables and then 6 syllables, then 8 and then 6, and that's a full stanza. And the 2 6-syllable stanzas lines have to rhyme. So here's what it does. It starts off and says, the first verse of the poem, not the psalm. Bow down thy. Oh no, actually, I didn't get the beginning. It says Psalm 86 in the King James Version does not follow common meter, but I can write it in common meter for you. Here's my attempt.
That's even that. Right
Even that
there.
just sounds so
Yes.
human, right?
Yep.
So, and it starts
Well,
off.
most humans would know that it's not written.
That's true. It's true. So it starts off and says, "Bow down thine ear, O Lord, to me, and hear my humble cry. I am in need and poor indeed. To thee alone I cry." And then it inserts a chorus that it creates its own chorus to be repeated after every verse. The chorus is, "Have mercy, Lord, and answer me. I seek thy face in need. For thou art good and ready to forgive in word and deed." And then I'll just do the second verse. "Preserve my soul, for I am one who trust is in thy name. Thou art my God, be merciful and save me from all shame." And then it continues with the chorus and other verses. So after your Bible study this week, the last one this week, Mr. Robinson, of your month-long series, which, by the way, everyone should know was fantastic. Thank you, Mr.
Well,
Robinson. On the Exodus and the time between the beginning of the Exodus all the way up to Mount Sinai. After this week's Bible study you did, because the Song of Moses was sung in Exodus 15, I did the same thing. I said, "Hey, ChatGPT, rewrite the Song of Moses in common meter," and it's beautiful. I mean, you could put that to music and make a hymn. It just did a fantastic job. So anyway, that was a wake up call. And then I'll just mention one more because I was impressed with that.
Mm-hmm.
It's clearly not conscious, and you can tell sometimes it is actually very stupid. I'll emphasize, like I mentioned in the article, these things are no smarter in terms of actual real intelligence than your toaster. Mm-hmm. That your toaster is programmed to warm your bread. These things are programmed to imitate human speech, and so they do. However, then the first time I discovered, or it became popular or noticeable, a DALL-E 2, which is an image generating artificial intelligence that, just like ChatGPT 3, it's been fed on images, just tons and tons of images and their descriptions. So you could type anything you want and it'll try to generate an image of that. And sometimes the image does look very strange and garbage, and other times it's just fantastic. Like you could tell it, you want, what was it? Cows flying through space, right? Mr. Ben Graham did some of these for us for the magazine.
That was actually kind of cool.
Yeah, we'll include some of those. The one he did of the cat was magnificent. But you just give it a text prompt, and it does its best to give that for you. Whether you want it photoreal, you want it to look like digital art, you want it to look like a movie set, whatever you want, it'll do its best. And then comes others. There's Midjourney, Stable Diffusion. Midjourney was the one we played with the most for this article. And the idea, knowing that there's no intelligence, but even someone as unartistic as I am could produce images. Of course, I'm not really producing them. I'm just coming up with the prompt. That was astonishing to me, that we're now at a stage where people will look at some piece of art and think, wow, who could have done this? This is magnificent. And it could just be some guy using this software and giving just the right prompt.
Well, that almost sets the stage for what are the implications of AI going forward. Before we do, I don't have much to add to that. Like, so much of my journey was actually through your journey. And, you would constantly text me like the queries you'd made and what the results were. And I had to admit, I grew increasingly impressed, especially because I think you and I talked about this earlier today. It wasn't that it could chat back and forth with you and seem like you were, like if you just let go, you would just assume you're talking to a human being. Like that's impressive in its own right. But it's all the parameters you can place on it, or all the what do you call your you put certain stipulations around it, as you've already articulated. Do it in an old English style. As if Mr. Burns was doing it or something. All down. But just that, and it would do it. It would mimic. I'm struggling to describe.
No, the personality. It would try to imitate the personality and
right. What'd you say? You had Thanos. Trying to convince.
Yeah, the boys did something where we like the Animaniacs, the cartoon from the '90s, and they said write a play in which the Animaniacs meet Darth Sidious. And man, it's got him on the Death Star, and he's speaking like Darth Sidious. He's just angry, and he's frankly trying to go to sleep, but they keep showing up, it essentially combines what they would do in their cartoons with the personality of the Emperor in Star Wars, and it's like it doesn't really know anything. It's not sentient, but yet the algorithm can somehow
really
figure all that
impressive.
out. It is impressive.
But since I'm a little more, well, I would say, I don't know. It's when I started seeing our own AI generated, like we're putting in well, it was two things. It was one, Ben Graham started showing me, like on Midjourney, all these other AI generated arts that other people had done, and the advantage of that is you could see what words they used to create it. So you could say, oh, you can tell it to make it in such and such a style. Oh, I like the way that looks, and you'd add it to yours, and it would add that. Maybe the difference between watercolor versus oil painting. It would do
Right.
to mimic that style. But when we started querying our own, and what was fascinating about it was, it really was, like you said, it was a mixed bag. There were some images that were disappointing. There were some that were really close but had a tail coming out of a foot. One of the cats had a tail coming out of the foot. But then every so often it would just nail it, and you would just be like, wow, if I didn't know this was generated by an AI machine, we would have no idea.
Right. I appreciate your saying that because, I think I suggested doing AI as a topic for the podcast, like, I don't know, some weeks ago. And I think you were a little nonplussed, and I kind of got why, because honestly, what was on my mind was sort of a philosophical discussion about sentience, which, who wants that? Well, some people do want that podcast, but it didn't seem as fitting for this. But, this week, there was a time when it seemed like something, an interest kind of was sparked in you, and it seemed like it was when you and Ben were working together, and it is astonishing to see, right?
So the way I would term my turn in interest and astonishment is the implications.
Yeah.
I read an article a few days ago. I didn't read the detail. I read a summary of an article, which always frustrates my wife. I said, I saw what the headline is. They told me everything because she wanted to know why I didn't read the article. But basically it was, starting in January, Amazon has already been flooded. Now, I don't know if Amazon knows or what, but they've been flooded with new publications that have been created with ChatGPT.
Oh, like books?
Like the one I saw, the one example they used was a guy, he was very upfront with it. He'd made some kind of children's book, and he told it what story he wanted him to write, and he had one of these AI image generators illustrate it for him. And it would still take a while. That was one thing. Ben spent the better part of a day trying to get the exact image that we wanted to use for page 16. But man, to think that you could have a one-person team that could put together a 32-page kids book, maybe coloring book or something, in a couple of days, a week tops. It's mind-boggling. I mean, why would a newspaper have a huge staff anymore? You just would plug in the parameters of a story, the who, what, where, and why. Now write a story about a tragic murder scene last night in Detroit at, and all the details.
Right.
Sorry, Bill and Rebecca, about the Detroit thing. It's our friends. So you have that, and then the art generating, again, same kind of thing. Are there a whole bunch of graphic designers out there that are now would be considered useless because why would I use an actual human being to generate artwork, which I don't agree with that. But you could see how if you just wanted something, you could shortcut all of this. And that's just scratching the surface of the implications of what AI can do.
It is fascinating, and the fact is, if something is, I'm not going to get into the math and the logic and philosophy of it, but it's long been established by this philosophical construct called a Turing machine, that if humans can do it, you can program something to do it. And we often don't think that's possible, but if you're really just talking about something that imitates what humans can do, you generally can. And that's, on one hand, we are far from it, really, the full reproductions, because like you said, you asked for this cat picture, and then it's got a weird lizard tail sticking out of the cat's foot. Why is that? I had it actually generate, because we were exploring images to illustrate for this issue of the magazine, and I had it generate a portrait of President Biden in the style of Vanity Fair. You have Ann Leibovitz takes those pictures, and it actually looks really good. He looks great sitting there. Frankly, I think he would love to be depicted in such a way, except for the fact when you look careful, he's got his legs crossed, but the top leg blends into the bottom leg around his calf until the end he's only got 1 foot. And at first you look at it, you don't notice, but the more closely you look, you think, oh, well, that's monstrous. Or what it routinely seems to mess up so frequently is the number of fingers on a hand. So you're looking at a picture and it's like, oh, look at that model. She's out and about in New York. But then you look at her hand and she's got like 6, 7 fingers. And then maybe on where her hand is on her waist, maybe it's got 8 fingers. It's like, wow, what is going on?
So maybe she's a hand model?
I guess she would have some special skills in that regard. But yeah, in some ways, here's the thing: it doesn't actually know what it's doing.
Yeah.
It doesn't know how many fingers are on a person's hand. It doesn't even know necessarily that it's a person. It's just taking your text and it's trying to reduce the error between what your text says and what you possibly expect based on how that text ties into all the things it's been exposed to before. And it really does take some skill to start figuring out the exact prompts to help communicate to it. Like, for instance, just knowing, it hit me how distinctive Vanity Fair photo shoots are, that I recognize, you know what, if I mention that, I bet that's really going to highlight it and it's going to help narrow it down on a particular style. But it's growing. There are those like kind of, I've seen people praise and make fun of the chatbot's ability to write code. Like you can say, oh, write a Python program to do this or that. Well, if you go to ChatGPT, they did test it and had it actually write original code for an app on your phone. I might have mentioned this in the article. I can't remember. An original app on your phone that would display pictures. And they said the code, it needed 1 or 2 fixes, and it was not the most beautiful program you've ever seen, but it was completely functional. Well, that was, 2021, or when I wrote that article. This stuff's accelerating so fast. I sent something to Mr. Ben Graham. Ben Graham here at the Charlotte office is our expert on user experience and user interface and user experience for web pages. And sure enough, this guy that I follow on Twitter, who's really very good at learning to tease out from these Midjourney and these other apps on how to get artwork. He was showing software they have now where the AI will generate your user interface, and it's good looking user interface. Well, people can look at that and go, oh yeah, that's fine. It wrote a paragraph, but look how it messed up. Or it wrote this program, but oh, that's ugly program, and that wouldn't even work. Okay, that's right. And this is February 2023. Mm-hmm. If you think that by February 2024, it's not going to be that much better. If you think by February 2025, it's not going to be astonishingly, incredibly good, you have no idea what you're talking about.
So that reminds me of some of our biblical scriptures. I had one come to my mind, which we've heard it a lot in the church, but it's, no, that's not the one I want. Hold on. That's the one you had. Yeah, Daniel. Is that Daniel what you're thinking?
Oh, no, I don't have that.
Daniel 12:4. So, this is at the end of Daniel, and he's gotten what he's going to get, and he's kind of curious to understand a little bit more. But he's told, "But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase." Now, Mr. O'Gwyn used to point out all the time how far we came in the 20th century in terms of technology and learning. He'd point out a couple different things. World War II opened with a cavalry charge in Poland and ended with an atomic bomb in Japan.
Right.
That's 6 years. And that's pretty impressive. But the amount of what we learned in that century stacked up against what we knew previous to that was like astounding. But it's almost like you haven't seen nothing yet. I mean, the last 10, 15 years in particular, like, you're exactly right. You think it's pretty good now. The rate at which things like this are getting better is breathtaking. A year from now, I mean, we really are now, in my opinion, at risk of. You thought that there was fake news before, completely video generated, sounds authentic. I mean, you and I watched a video here recently of a politician who gave a speech that he would never give, but it sounded like him, and it was quite impressive, but it was entirely fake.
Yes. In fact, we can use this as a preview of the article coming out in the April-May issue. But that's exactly right, because now, in fact, I played a fake podcast for you earlier that was, it wasn't real, but it was supposed to be Joe Rogan talking to Ben Shapiro. Thankfully, there were no vulgarities.
Yes.
AI didn't produce. That was nice. The guy wrote a script, I guess. But it was Joe Rogan talking to Ben Shapiro, not really, but the fake, about asking him if he'd like to have a rat like Ratatouille, control his actions and such. And the conversation was completely made up, but someone had written the script, I guess, for it. But the AI that mimicked their voices,
It was very good.
it was very good. It sounded just like Joe Rogan, and even their minor irritations, like because Ben Shapiro was kind of irritated at the question, and it sounded like actually kind of like you. You do great impersonations, Mr. Robinson, so it would have been kind of like what you would have done. But it was fantastic, and so the article is about the potential of these things to be used to deceive. So I won't hit on that too much. We'll kind of save some of that for the article. But in terms of implications, you're exactly right. Now we're actually not just going out and searching and gathering information, but we're actually creating tools, if you will, to go out and do some of the searching and categorizing and collapsing for us. It's not just search. I mean, you can ask these things to summarize information. In fact, let me give a good example that I did. I mentioned a while ago the Exodus 15, the Song of Moses, and I had asked it to rewrite that in Common Meter. So it did. It's kind of limited by how much you can do in one session, so it didn't finish the whole thing, and I told it to continue, and it continued. Well, then when it did the whole thing, I thought, well, let me see if it can actually summarize the lesson. So I added another prompt, and after it had done, I told it this: write an original concluding coda, also in Common Meter, summarizing the whole of the song. So I asked it to give me, so now it's having to extract the meaning, right? And it was actually fantastic. It's very short. It does it in 2 verses with a chorus. It says, "Let us then sing of God's great might and how he saves his own. With joy and praise and all our strength, let us exalt his throne." And then it gives the chorus: "Hallelujah, hallelujah, the Lord is great in might. Hallelujah, hallelujah, he triumphs in our sight." Then the second verse, the last verse: "He saves us from our greatest foe and guides us to our rest. His love endures forevermore. In him we are most blessed." And then it concluded with the chorus. Now that's not it.
You told it to rhyme?
No, I just told Common Meter, so it rhymed on its own, right?
Okay.
But
I missed that.
the fact is, it kind of collapsed the whole Song of Moses. So now you've with all the information out there, you have tools that can process the information, summarize it for you, highlight details. And in terms of implications, it's hard to imagine this not just increasing in information exploding, both information and misinformation, which the article is about, but also mentioning earlier about how these things are starting to write code. They're starting to just write. They're starting to produce images. They're increasingly starting to produce original video. There's already some AI that if you start describing the video game you want to create, it actually starts piecing together elements, and you can see this 3D world with the video game pieces coming together. Google, I think it's Google, one of them has original video. It's still choppy, but you start describing the video you want to see, and it starts creating a video. Like I saw one paper had a clip. It said, "Show me an astronaut walking on another planet, and then have him dance, and then have him walk his dog." And out of nothing, not really out of nothing, out of all the images and video it's processed, it creates that scene. It looked like some weird art, kind of forward-looking artistic interpretation. But if you didn't hear that description and you just saw the video, that's how you would describe it. An astronaut's walking here, and then he starts doing a dance, then he starts walking his dog. So one of the verses that came to my mind, and it might sound a little weird to use, but again, what's our theme on the podcast? I like to repeat it. It's thinking biblically. So how does the Bible inform me about all this? Well, I want to save the misinformation stuff for the the article that's coming out. So look for that article and read that. But also in terms of your future, planning your job. There's a verse, it's repeated twice in Proverbs. And so if Proverbs says it twice, it must be important. Of course, everything's important. And it says this in Proverbs 22 and verse 3: a prudent man foresees evil and hides himself, but the simple pass on and are punished. Now, why do I say that? In this particular case, it's easy to think, like, oh no, I've known some people that they just love computers and they're going to jump into computers, or they love to write and they just can't wait to get a job writing. Or, well, you're looking at a potential future where everything you do can be replaced by a computer. You don't think that might be real, but there was a time, for instance, back in my day, when human beings made automobiles, worked on an assembly line, and then you had all this innovation with robots capable of doing that. And people were saying, oh, we're going to lose our jobs. And that was part of the claim was, we can't, all this technology coming in, you can't just fire all these workers. It's just not fair to them. But in the end, no one cares if it's fair. They care if the price is low.
Yep.
And the product is sufficient quality. And next thing you know, if you're a real good copywriter, because I have subscribed to a copywriter service in terms of it's more an advertisement for their services, which I've never actually wanted to pay for, but I still go ahead and get their newsletter. And you can tell they're scrambling a bit, and they're trying to say, hey, look at all this AI. Well, tell you what, here's how you can use it, in writing copy. They're having to adapt and change to this environment. Don't think that, man, I'm the best coder in my peer group, or you cannot guarantee that you're not about to be replaced by something that can do what you do very well. And so Mr. Jonathan McNair was here with us on the podcast one time, and he talked about making sure you acquire skills. I would seek to be as well-rounded a person as you can, knowing that you're going to have specialized tools come out that may be able to do part of your job. Depending on how technical it is, you might want to make sure you have a well-rounded set of skills and keep up with what's current.
It feels like we are living in a world where humanity is slowly becoming obsolete.
It can seem that way, right?
Well, I mean, if technology and AI replaces all these things that humans do, a small group of people truly benefit from that, and the rest of everyone else. Let me use an example. And I don't know that this, you check me on this, Mr. Smith, and tell me if you think this is applicable. There's a controversial nation that I've generally grown fond of, and it's called the French. And, the French are truly unique in some ways among the nations, and you kind of have to take your time to get to know them and appreciate where they're coming from. And when you do, you really do, you can grow an appreciation for them. And one of the things that they do that I really like is it's almost as if they collectively as a nation, as an identity, got together and said, so there are certain things that we're not going to compromise on for convenience, and we're going to keep it. And so, for example, one of the things we learned the last time we went was that everybody, I might get the details wrong, but the sense of this is correct. It's either, I think it might be every Frenchman, but for sure every Parisian is given like 3 or 4 euros a day as a stipend to go to a cafe, because that part of what makes Paris charming, in my opinion, and why we like going there is the whole cafe culture. And the way we would be more likely to do it in the U.S. is we would slowly but surely gut every charming cafe in Paris and replace it with a big chain store. And there is some of that certainly occurred in Paris, but the cafe culture remains. Lots of inviting places, outdoor seating, coffee places, restaurants. In America, we don't even have we hardly have dedicated places at all. We have something called the grocery store or the supermarket.
Right.
There, they still have places that are bakeries or cheese shops. They certainly have grocery stores, but even then, well, they have the mega ones in places, but there's still lots of smaller ones around the city. And they decided that cafe culture was important to them as a culture, and they wanted to preserve it, and they didn't want to get it stamped out, which larger businesses easily could have done. You could have a model that was more profitable and more efficient. And the Parisians were like, yeah, no, we kind of like buying an espresso in the morning and standing there for 15 minutes on our way to work and watching the
Right.
world go by. And that's how I feel a little bit with all this AI stuff. It's like, it's incredibly impressive. But I kind of miss good old fashioned human ingenuity and creativity. And I don't want machine creativity.
You know, my wife and I have talked about that because I feel that, because I like to think about what level of technology will we have in the millennium, right?
Right. Yes.
And I think that, putting aside a whole sorts of little tiny details like, can we mine certain minerals safely, blah, all of those details, put them aside in terms of just principles. I think there's a good argument to be made for the fact that God is going to advise us and say, in some instances, because we'll still be smart, hopefully we'll be in the glorified kingdom of God and we'll help him advise. But the humans during the millennial reign of Christ, they'll still be intelligent and they'll still figure out ways to, to shorten the level of work they have to do or to make it less of a burden. And that's going to be wonderful to see, the cotton gin, what a difference that made. But I also suspect that God, Jesus Christ, will also counsel in some cases and say, look, I know that seems wonderful. It's going to make life easier in this way. It's going to make life easier in that way. It's going to make goods cheaper in this way. But unlike you, I can see down the road 500 years.
Mm-hmm.
Let me show you what will be the state of civilization. What would be the condition of your great, 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 great grandchildren if this technology or whatever it is were available everywhere? And we would find that we're kind of lesser as people, that it is something taking us down. And I feel the same way about Europe. We loved that cafe culture. And while, you made a good point about like grocery store chains and say Walmarts, this AI stuff is almost like the equivalent of that in the information realm and the artistic realm.
That's a good analogy.
Where suddenly, instead of human expertise, you can just start churning it out like a big store chain. And next thing you know, it's you don't need the other.
So here I'll stereotype another culture. And it's interesting because America has a bit of a dichotomy as a nation, because I remember in the 80s, when the Japanese economy was booming and they worked, the Japanese work super hard. They can be really dedicated to their jobs and work many more hours than the U.S. did. And we were viewed as kind of lazy by comparison. But on the other hand, America is by many viewed as like overly driven. I'm totally on board. And this, people will not agree with me on this. I'm totally on board with the European style. Again, my friends in France, August is a whole holiday month practically. Let's take a month off. Hey, we'll work 11 months and let's take a month and we'll go down to the beach or whatever. And Americans, my statistics will be rusty, but took the least amount of vacation of almost any nation. And so, what is my point with all of that? It's I listen all the time to great podcasts that have great information on it, but there's so many that are dedicated to being more. How do I become more productive? How do I focus and get more done? And I think, I don't know, past a certain point, what's the point of just endless production and endless efficiency?
Right.
And I would argue, when you analyze how God has it done, because this is what what you just said made me think of it. Think about the Sabbath, the most inefficient day of the year, except is it?
Right.
What do? We recharge on that day. And do we get anything done in terms of like productivity and building something and fixing the house and getting your new novel written? No, none of those things occur. But it's a weekly recharge and a connection with your Creator, and it's not a productive day. And it's one of it's one of the 10 Commandments, of course. And I just think all the time about, there's a point at which endless productivity is just pointless.
Yeah.
And you do have to be productive. There are things you have to take care of. And so many things, like, I think lately we've been involved in bread making. My wife has been making bread for a while. And now there's a whole other thing I don't want to get into details about, but somebody else we're talking to that makes bread all the time. And you get into the whole idea of bread. bread's incredibly inefficient. Like growing, working the ground,
Right.
like especially the old-fashioned way, growing grain, reaping the grain, and then what do they call it? Threshing the grain, where you separate the grain, and
Right.
then you got to grind the grain. And there's different combinations you can do, and then you somehow take this magical formula of something you grew and grind it into flour, put it with water and a little bit of yeast, and you have amazing bread. But it takes a long time. Like the way I know the French aren't the only ones, but so much of the bread that we like has a French origin in it, and like making a tasty French boulet, a lot of work. Pulling, stretching, letting it rest, letting it rise, doing it again. This is folding. This whole thing, but it yields an amazing result.
Right, and that is, I think some of the AI is being developed. It's people just seeing what they can do. We're human beings, but also that's kind of the dream, right? We'll just have little robotic, artificial intelligence servants kind of handle everything for us. Until the next thing you know, we look like all the characters in WALL-E on the ship, sucking down our shakes as we're floating around.
Oh, what a great example. See, I think that was by far the most realistic what our future would be like if we allowed technology to take care of us. Like the Star Treks, all the Star Treks. I think that's incredibly unrealistic.
Yes.
Putting aside all the aliens. If you have a ship that can go anywhere and the replicators, what do you want to eat tonight?
Produce anything you want in a moment.
What's the motivation? And I know that the idea in Star Trek was mankind like the adventure was boldly going into the universe and exploring it. So it's not like it was without some kind of
challenge. But not everybody on Earth is doing that.
Right. We would become bums. It would be like WALL-E. We would be walking. That's so how crude. Why don't we float on our anti-grav cycle and go to the replicator and get whatever we want? We'd become bums.
I should highlight to individuals. We're talking about the Pixar movie WALL-E, not the person sitting across from the table. I do like to walk. But no, I thought the same thing. And part of the theme is by and large, right? It's supposed to be like a giant Walmart type company. And there is something that, God said, work 6 days of the week. There's something about your hands in the soil or your hands doing the job. He didn't intend us, I would say in the Western world in general, a lot of the world would say, hey, you might have it easy, but we don't. But boy, here in America, at least, our lives are so relatively easy.
Well, I heard somebody, a commentator on like what's going on in the world right now, and their conclusion was, I don't think it was limited to Americans, but it definitely was the West, is we're bored. Life is way too easy. Now, look, caveat, I know there are people that really struggle and have problems, and that is not my point.
Right.
But compared to where we were 100, 150, 200 years ago, where, man, that wheat crop got wiped out by, I heard this from an old timer in our church. At this point, I can say old timer. He was old then, and that was 20 years ago. And he talked about growing wheat, I think. And he said there was nothing more discouraging than you would go through the whole, you'd get the right amount of rain, everything worked, it was a bumper crop, and then the hail would come and destroy it. You were never out of the woods. And we take for granted now that the grocery stores will be full, which is increasingly looking kind of dicey.
Right.
But life has been very easy for us compared to the struggle in the past of not starving, having adequate shelter, getting sick. We take for granted actually that our access to modern medical care, and that we're bored and we need a challenge. In fact, there's a podcaster that I started listening to. In fact, the way I discover a lot of newer podcasters that I like is by hearing them on other podcasts that I like. And this guy had shown up on so many podcasts that I respected. I thought, who is this guy? So this guy is his podcast, and Mr. Smith was just telling me recently that his podcast is now ranked fairly highly in terms
really
of
high.
Yeah. It's called Huberman Labs, and his name, he is a professor of neurobiology and ophthalmology at Stanford Medical. He's medical school, and
you didn't even read that, just so you know, folks. That was off the top of his head.
I made myself memorize it, and it's absolutely fascinating. You're probably better off engaging with him actually on being on somebody else's podcast, because he'll tell you up front, he says his podcasts are very technical. So I only went to his podcast after being intrigued by his other podcasts. But he talks, we know so much about how the brain actually works. It's actually kind of mind-boggling, no pun intended. And so one of the things, why do we bring this up at all? The idea of that we need a struggle. We need something to contend with. It's built into our very brain, into our biology. And so I don't want to get into the technicalities of how this is possible, but my understanding this is quite possible, is when you give people the opportunity to trigger a sensation in their brain, any of them, any kind of pleasure, any kind of, I guess, not pleasure, technical phrase there. There's one that they pick, that humans will pick overwhelmingly over any, and it's described as, the feeling is described as being mildly frustrating, but with the expectation of a good outcome or something good is coming. And so if they describe it as if you kind of hit this button and it stimulates this area of your brain, it's like something good is coming, something good is coming, something good is coming.
Right. I'm working hard right now. Things aren't, but there's a good thing at the end of it.
And I think if you think about it, we all sort of understand this instinctively. Delayed gratification is the most rewarding kind of reward. I've been a real wordsmith today.
We'll ask ChatGPT to rewrite that part.
Oh, would you please? In fact, I would suspect even our youngest podcast listener has experienced the following. If you get up in the morning and you're kind of a bum and you don't really do anything, and you go straight to playing video games and eating dessert, that never feels that satisfying. You didn't accomplish anything. You rewarded yourself, but you didn't accomplish anything. But when you've really struggled to get something done, write a paper, go build something, go mow the yard, whatever, you come in after a hot summer day having mown your yard, and maybe you let it go a little too long, so it's extra thick. We struggled the last couple of years with a lawnmower we should have replaced. But to come in when that's done and get a drink of water and a snack or whatever, the reward after the struggle is by far the most fulfilling thing we have. And so when technology takes over too much and does too much for us, and we have to put no effort in, and we can just punch in, hey, write my school paper, and hey, let's get an illustration while we're at it, you've accomplished nothing. I mean, it's not going to feel good to us or be fulfilling in any way.
Right. And that is part of the challenge of this, is a lot of teachers are complaining and recognizing that easily this AI is writing papers, if you will, at the kind of level, say 8th grade, whatever it is they're expecting to see. And that would be one of the lessons I want to make sure, because we have, audiences from, again, teens to young adults. Don't fall into the temptation to use this stuff to create shortcuts for yourself. I think what Mr. Robinson is saying there is, not only are you cheating, which is bad, right? Make sure you fulfill your assignments and things asked of you, that you're really doing them. But at the other hand, you're really robbing yourself. I know it sounds so, it's like, oh, okay, whatever. No, you really are. These are the things you do are the things that make you. Don't outsource the opportunity for struggle to something else just because you can. The easier way is not always the better way. It's worth your time and effort and what it's going to do to who you are to go through those things yourself, and definitely be far more rewarding.
Another thing that gets into a different podcast. So I scratched that. I was going to talk about how our limbic system works, because it's kind of interesting.
Oh, wow. Okay, definitely let's talk about the limbic system some of the time. We're coming close. The one thing I did want to say is, in terms of looking out into the future, what do we anticipate with things like this? What would we expect biblically out of this? Because there's certainly no Bible prophecy that says, and thus the AI machine rose from the ashes and did such and such. But we do have kind of a bit of a warning. Back in I won't read it, but I'll refer to it. In Genesis chapter 11, it was after the flood, and mankind was all together, and they wouldn't leave. God's plan for mankind is for families to separate and spread out all over the earth and develop their own civilizations in different places, and mankind was unwilling to do that. As the Tower of Babel story, they stayed in one place and refused to separate. And God didn't like that. In Genesis 11, it says that he comes down and he notices that they're all together in complete rejection of his plan for humanity. And so he ends up confusing their languages and forcing them to separate into their different families, because now suddenly no one can understand each other. But it's interesting in that time what he said of humanity. While they were all together and refused to separate, he says that now, well, I'm going to paraphrase because I didn't turn there, but no matter what it is they want to do, they'll be able to do it. Nothing will be withheld from them. And he doesn't say that like it's a good thing.
Yes.
Like when mankind is not restricted, and I would add us, when we are not restricted as individuals, you as a human being listening, we don't do well with utter lack of restriction. When it comes to mankind and technology, our technology has always outpaced our moral capacity. Well, I say always, I'm speaking in large words, maybe not always true. But generally, our technology seems to always outpace the development of our morals and our ethics to where we understand how to actually work with this. Mankind unrestricted is just not the best thing. And AI has that potential to suddenly remove a lot of restrictions from us. And as much as I'm excited about the tech, I'm not excited about necessarily what we'll be doing with it.
You know, you reminded me of a podcast I listened to last summer, and we've actually referenced this individual before, Dan Carlin. I think we referenced him in
historian,
Germany
right?
Prophecy. Yeah. So he has a number of podcasts that he still has public facing, because a lot of them, a lot of the good podcasters have actually gone behind a paywall, which is a whole nother thing. But he has one called The Destroyer of Worlds. And it's the aftermath of the creation and the detonation of the atomic bombs at the end of World War II. And so it kind of starts off with the atomic bombs being used, and then the aftermath of it and what it meant and how it shaped the world and the different philosophies on what we could do, ranging from, wow, maybe that wasn't a great idea to create an atomic bomb, all the way to people who thought it was a gift and it should be used,
Wow.
And it's actually quite a fascinating, but what I think most people would get if you listen to it, like going away from it, would be, one day we'll regret having made the atomic bomb. Because we don't have the humanity, especially not governed by God's rules, like at all.
Right.
We don't have the capacity or the self-control to not eventually use them again.
Yeah. I think maybe we can wrap up with that observation so AI, if we're going to summarize, it's amazing. It's not just amazing at what it can do now, but for its potential capabilities coming down the line. It'd be wonderful to revisit this topic, say February of next year, just to see how far things have gone. But on the other hand, in the end, whenever suddenly there's no restrictions to what you can do, what makes the real difference all of a sudden is character. When all the restrictions on you are released, whatever determines the next steps is your character. Do you have godly character or do you not? And I think as AI grows in capability, we're about to see who has godly character and who doesn't.
Right, because what happens when the AI gets the nuclear launch codes?
Smith and Robinson.